Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Steve Culbertson. I'm the President and CEO of Youth Service America, and on behalf of Harris Wofford and his 86th birthday party, I'd like to welcome you to the Fahrenheit Room. So, if there was any question about whether we were actually going to have this birthday or whether it was going to take place, our good friend Chris Matthews made the point the other night on television. He was telling a story about Harris. And he said, he was going in about the call, the Martin Luther King call, and then he announced, he looked into the camera and he goes, and he's still alive. So thank you, Chris. He is still alive and kicking, and even more than that. And you're going to hear a lot tonight. So we are absolutely delighted. Harris, this must be a little bit like your life flashing before you, when you see your good friend Sergeant Shriver's son and grandson, Tim and Tim, sitting on stage left here, and then you look all the way across at your family, the three Wofford children sitting here. Perhaps we often talk about Harris's great legacy of service to country, but certainly one of his greatest legacies are his three children, and we're thrilled that all three of them are here tonight. And so many great and wonderful people who are deciding to be here, sitting in the back, standing in the back, sitting in chairs, and really come to gather and to honor you. For the last 16 years that I've been the CEO of YSA, Harris has been my great partner in crime on engaging a certain segment of the population, first in the U.S. when I started, and then he helped me expand it around the world, of young people. His really, as he says, his favorite group, those from 5 to 25 that we've worked together on to engage in solving the problems of the world. And I cannot tell you how important his leadership has been, not only as a good friend, as a good board member, but a real deep thinker on how to look at young people as assets and resources and how to expand their participation around the world. This is our 25th anniversary coming up this year at YSA. And for those 25 years, it's a big anniversary. Thank you. And we've taken this organization not just from a US-based organization, but now to an international one that now operates in over 100 countries on 6 continents. So we're thrilled to be able to have the 25th anniversary of Global Youth Service Day, which is also going to take place in the next year. And I see people like Daryl, who built his first playground when he was on the staff at YSA, and of course Michael and Alan, we became their fiscal agents back in the 80s when they first started their program. And so much of YSA's history is in the room. My good partner in crime, Diana Aviv from Independent Sector, and I serve on the board now of Campfire USA, and 4-H, Don Floyd is here. There's just too many people to even pick out of the crowd. And of course, we're thrilled that Aaron Williams is here, has helped us expand internationally with the Peace Corps. So many wonderful, wonderful people. I would be remiss if I didn't also recognize Kathy Payne from State Farm, who has been our great partner for more than a decade, really building this movement. And Kathy and State Farm have been just extraordinary, extraordinary partners. And of course, our wonderful, wonderful host tonight, the Ritz-Carlton, who is really throwing this little soiree for Harris. And we're grateful to the Ritz-Carlton hotels for what they're doing and how they are supporting this effort. I also want to, before I turn over the microphone to our two special speakers who you really came to hear, I want to recognize General and Mrs. Powell. I met them. General Powell's service to this nation, both in the military and in the federal government, and as an incredible Secretary of State, has no peer. And I met General Powell 16 years ago when we were planning the President's Summit for America's Future that eventually became America's Promise. And he's still here, he's still alive, and we're still going strong. So it's great to have you, and of course Mrs. Powell, who now chairs America's Promise, to have him with us. So it's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So now what you really came to hear, two great Americans and two great friends. I will start on my far left, Jonathan Capehart, who you don't really need an introduction. He's on MSNBC practically 24 hours a day. And if he's not there, he's across the street from YSA at the Washington Post, which we happen to be neighbors of. And so Jonathan was kind enough to accept my invitation to grill Senator Wofford tonight. And he said,
"It's not going to be a grilling. It's going to be
we're going to have some fun.
Storytelling.
And it's going to be storytelling at its best. But Jonathan was really graceful to do this, and we're really glad to have you here. And of course, the guest of honor, I really don't want to say anything more about him. I'm going to just let you start talking. But thank you very much for coming tonight. Harrison Jonathan.
Thank you, Steve, for that introduction, and also thank you very much for the invitation to be a part of this, a great celebration of Harris Wofford. Many words come to mind when one hears your name, Harris. Thinker, traveler, author, senator, statesman. You've lived and continue to live a life filled with meaning and importance that most people, except for more than a few of you in the room, will never lead. You've not only been a witness to history, you've been an active participant. From Martin Luther King, President John F. Kennedy and the Civil Rights Movement, Sergeant Shriver and the formation of the Peace Corps, to an appointment to the U.S. Senate and the words you shared with a promising freshman years after your departure from that body, you are filled with the firsthand observations that bring to mind another word for you: storyteller. Tonight we're going to hear some of the stories that defined your life and defined our nation from you. Now, Senator, you and I are very much the same when it comes to storytelling. You're precise, and no detail goes unuttered for fear of ruining the arc of the story. But Senator, really, let's try our best to keep this to 60 minutes, since you and I are the ones that stand between them and the bar. So let's begin. It was a 6-month trip around the world with your grandmother that set you on the path that would define your life.
Well, you were sitting around the table the other night, pressing me on what made me tick. The ticking benign bomb that went off when I was 12 years old was my grandmother persuaded my parents to let me accompany her around the world for 6 months. 6 months. And when we sailed from New York Harbor, I undoubtedly felt the way the star of Titanic felt when he made his way through second class, up to first class, out to the bow of the boat, flung his arms out to the sea, and was sailing here. Well, when we went out past the Statue of Liberty, I did the same thing. My grandmother was somewhat lame and deaf, and somewhat of an anti-mame too, but I got her on a deck chair.
Now that's a grandma.
And then I went up through the classes, through the first class, out to the bow, and successfully got through there without anybody stopping me. If you look as if you belong, you often can get through doors, and I got to the bow and did just that. Except that then, unlike when my grandsons go around the world with me, in honor of her, I offer a 6-week trip around the world, and 4 of my 6 grandsons, only sons so far so good. They're 6 weeks in the world. You get America coming back now. But my parents were saying, please write a postcard once a month. And you really were away from America. And the letters took 3 weeks to catch up on our 13 different ships we were on, mostly freighters. But this little program that was put together has that sort of timeline of long journeys long and short. And this was a long journey in a very deep sense. Different, very, but somewhat like the Peace Corps as a changing experience. We were really away from America, and we were looking back. And for me, I came back to the 7th grade, a know-it-all foreign policy expert, and have remained so for better or worse. The world was the question. And I think the great gift of that trip was getting out of our own culture and seeing England being warned by Churchill of the Nazi menace, hearing Mussolini from the balcony take Italy out of the League of Nations, looking up as he proclaimed the Second Roman Empire, and then a fascist torchlight parade in front of us, huddling in the Church of Nativity on Christmas Eve as gunfire went off in Arab revolt of 37-38. This was now the beginning of 1938, Munich and all that, and the war coming. The war had already, in Bombay, we saw Gandhi go through the streets, but I had tonsillitis, so I didn't hear him on the beach. And many other stops, but last stop was, great stop, was Shanghai after the greatest bombardment modern world had ever seen. Most roofs of the city of Shanghai were gone. The population of the center city was gone. The Japanese sold looting permits, and mea culpa, I looted a former restaurant in ruins, more or less. The other tourists came out with art, with silver, with china, and I came out, to my grandmother's horror, with a 4-foot stuffed ostrich. And I threw the bird overseas.
No china, no silverware.
As we sailed into
no
Yokohama Harbor. But it had that trip was the reason I recommend long journeys. You can take a long journey into the classics of another civilization in books. It's harder to get a really long journey on the planet anymore, but you can do it. Peace Corps does it. And Special Olympics, in its own way, is doing that with many people experiencing different cultures deeply. And I think I would commend that to everybody. And the trips around the world with grandparents, or grandsons or granddaughters, after a Senate breakfast meeting that occasionally I would chair, that John Paul Simon got me into in order to get to know Republicans better, because the ones that went to the prayer meetings were two Republicans, each Democrat. And one of them I had presided, and he said, tell us about the trip around the world. And afterwards, several of them said, double-edged sword. That is the most important thing you ever said in the Senate. That's the one thing you've said that I could take home and actually do. Now, whether they've done it or not, I commend long journeys of whatever kind with whoever your loved ones are that are coming of age, for example. And then I would recommend for people when, the last two grandsons of David Wofford, I'll be 90 and 92 or something like that, when they turn 12 to take the trip. And I'm looking forward, perhaps, to them taking me around the world, which is actually what I thought I was doing with my grandmother. Looking back, I know why she planned everything, but I went and got the tickets in Bombay and things like that. So I was taking her around the world.
So the questions you asked then are still questions that remain for you today. But it was a question you were asked years later in India that particularly stung. Yes,
to my surprise, in a way, I was on the track of Gandhi on that later trip, 1949, on a fellowship for my wife and Claire and me to go to India. She was not a Gandhi lover, but I already was. He had been killed a year before we got there. And so my trail, which she gallantly went on, went to various difficult parts of India in terms of standard of living, let's say, for the interlopers who came in. It was a fairly rugged trip, enough so that when Alan Casey and Vanessa Kirsch came out to the beach to tell us they had good news, they were going to get married, and my wife finally, as they gushed with enthusiasm, telling us they were going to go first around the world, just like in the book India Fire they had read that Claire and I did in India. And finally, Claire, in her wonderful skeptical, practical sense, said, "Do you really want to get married? Do you know that you want to get married?" and you've already got the punchline, but they said, "Oh, absolutely." She said, "Then I really urge you to get married first, because if we had married first, I really don't think I would have married Harris." Now, in her fairness, I should say that she made a lot of the greater culture challenge. Maybe because of the trip before, I was immune to some of the things that shocked her as a debating champion and all that from South St. Paul. And she has vividly told some of my family how, it was a cultural shock to discover poverty of that kind. And to your point, I found that the Gandhians that we met, overwhelmingly, somebody in a group, in an ashram or wherever we were, would say, "What have you done about segregation? You're interested in Gandhi. What have you done about it? And specifically, have you ever gone to jail against segregation laws?" And for me, the world had been the thing. I was a fighter against the isolationists as a high school student. I had started the World Student Federalists in high school. It went on into college. I had no doubt that I was for all men are created equal, becoming a reality. But it was the world that had interested me. And so the world was telling me, basically, you better go home and look at the great blot on the American soul. And I came home resolved, with all due respect for the movement for world organization with power to keep the peace. I came home committed to the idea of getting involved in the civil rights movement and to catch two birds in one net, getting a law degree, which everybody that knew me thought I ought to go and get, and to get to know American Negroes then as peers, as fellow students. And I went and was the first white man to graduate from Howard Law School, which I am greatly in the debt of the trip around the world, I think, way back, and then the long journey with Claire 2 decades later.
I'm going to ask you question 2.1. What was the reaction to your choosing Howard to go to law school back then?
My family was half Southern, half Northern, in a strange way that you don't need to hear about today. But each side was half Southern, half Northern, from Mississippi on one side and from Brooklyn, New York on the other. And we started out in Johnson City, Tennessee. When I went back on trips we went back and forth to Washington, or through Washington, going from Johnson City, East Tennessee, Republican, non-slaveholding part of Tennessee that wanted to go with the Union but couldn't get it done, and New York. And we, often stopped in Washington, D.C., and I fell in love with Washington on those trips. But this family that was taking me around the world and the rest was quite shocked at my going. I was surprised at the depth of it. My parents were Republican, but the only Democrat in the family who had taken me around the world was, moaning that, of course, you can go and teach them, but you can't go and be a fellow student with them. My father was so worried that if I ever ran for political office, it would clearly just rule me out as someone who could ever be voted for who did that. And he went to Stringfellow Barr, the founder of the Great Books program at St. John's. He knew I admired him, a historian from Virginia. I learned later, I didn't know he'd done this, to ask his help, since he knew I respected Barr, to save me from this terrible fate. And Mr. Stringfellow Barr, the historian, said, "Mr. Wofford," he told me, "I said to your father," I said, "if your son ever goes into public office elections, I predict that by the time he does, it will be an asset that he did it." And sure enough, when I was running for the Senate, my father had died, unfortunately, and quite reconciled to Howard, and it was the initial shock that was hard on them. And then they, I think, were sort of proud of it in the end. But my father, I wish had been there, because when I was running 47 points behind, that's another story, but which I'm not supposed to tell you now.
Yeah, please don't skip ahead.
No, just the end of it is just, is very simple, that in black churches, from which we got a huge vote, a great increase in the usual votes, the ministers would say, whatever else they said about me, they said, "Oh, but the real thing to know is that 1950, take yourself back to 1950, he went to Howard Law School, etc. And the amens and the votes would have made my father very happy.
I mean, that's the closest you're going to get to having a black card, senator. So, okay.
No, the fellow from Illinois was Howard Law School. The one who had it briefly, Burris. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they've had two graduates
from Howard Law School. So India and Gandhi and the philosophy of nonviolence, and then its application to the civil rights struggle of African Americans. All of this came together when you met a preacher from Georgia.
Well, it's yes would be a nice short answer, right?
So it's ease into it.
But I came back from India while I was at Howard, and then when I was at Covington Burling Law Firm, and the book India Fire that my wife and I wrote together after India had recommended nonviolent direct action, Gandhian civil disobedience, and constructive service as an additional dimension the civil rights movement needed. And shortly before the Montgomery bus boycott, having written about this in the 1950 book and a lot of Quaker speeches and others, I gave a talk at Lincoln University that got distributed widely. Gandhi, the civil rights lawyer, making the case for the adding of civil disobedience, and if necessary, jail going, and distributed it widely, to which I got the most discouraging response from African American leaders. Thurgood Marshall wrote a hand note saying this is the most subversive idea the civil rights movement could have. We are doing everything we can, courageously they were doing it, to get white Southerners who think that segregation is the law of God to disobey integration laws of the Constitution and the Supreme Court and Congress. And if you get if the doctrine of if it goes against your conscience, you can peacefully disobey it, would open a Pandora's box, etc. It was a short note, but that was the thrust of his note. Dean Nelson, who had actually lived and worked with Gandhi and was part of the Negro group that visited him in 1937, said, "Come to America, show us how to do this in America." And Gandhi said, "I haven't made my message in India yet. You will have to bear the burden of going forward by yourself. I'm not ready to come. But it may be that through the American Negro, the unadulterated voice of nonviolence will be delivered to the world." And so I was discouraged, and this is in October of 1955, after getting that letter from Dean Nelson telling me that he sadly concluded, having been part of that, we need Gandhi here, that their American Negro has no Gandhi in him. And that very week, I think it was, the New York Times reported that Rosa Parks had gone to jail, like Gandhi, and the opening night of this one-day bus boycott that became a whole year, the idea of the Gandhi idea being imported to America had been advanced by a young preacher named Martin Luther King. And I rapidly started writing him, and Ralph Abernathy, whom I came to know fairly early, decided that we had to be in touch on phone. And then in due course, I got invited down to some strategizing, and that went on, off and on. He joked that I was the only volunteer lawyer in his midst who would help him go to jail instead of using all the tricks of the trade to keep him out.
So Ralph Abernathy introduces you to Martin Luther King, and you get to know each other. And then you were either giving a speech in Baltimore, or there was a drive from Baltimore to Washington. You and Claire and Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King. What was that like?
Well, I got King. We had talked on the phone off and on far more than I saw him. And he said, I want to meet your wife. And she wanted to meet him. And if you drive over to Baltimore and pick me up after my speech to this African-American fraternity, we can have a talk on the way back and go to the Mayflower and have a drink. And so we went and heard him give this excoriating speech for having that fraternity, spent more that weekend on the weekend in the hotel than the whole NAACP budget of the year. And we got in the car, and Claire and Coretta were in the back talking, and Martin and I were Gandhi strategizing. Now, King had been immersed in Gandhi. The same time in India, I was getting immersed in reading all of Gandhi. He had heard Mordecai Johnson give a great lecture on Gandhi, and while he was at Crozier Seminary outside of Philadelphia, he said in his book Stride Toward Freedom that I helped King doing some of the writing and editing. He said, I went out and bought all the books that I could find in a local bookstore on or by Gandhi. And when I went off to Boston for my doctorate, he said, I put it in the back of my head that someday I would do this. And you know, that day had come. So we're driving along, and we heard Coretta say to Claire, and Claire, you know, this course that Martin has chosen has led me to have a nightmare that keeps coming to me, that the end of the road he has chosen, he's going to be killed. And Martin turned around to her and said, Corey, I tell you to stop dreaming that way. Think of what we can do while we're here. And I didn't choose this. And it's accurate. He said, they asked me. And I said, yes. It's accurate because at this council that the Women's Council had convened, and E.D. Nixon, they decided to have a one-day boycott to ask this new young preacher to chair it. And he said yes. He had turned down various things before that. He wanted to get to know Montgomery more, but he said yes. And in the car, he hummed a spiritual that I still want to get the words to. But it was something like, and the Lord came by and asked, and my soul said yes. That was the ride back from Baltimore.
And thus began an enduring link between you and Martin Luther King, and then entered John F. Kennedy. And it was a link that was strengthened with just one phone call.
Well, the reason that I got involved with Kennedy on the civil rights side was that I had agreed after teaching at Notre Dame for a year to go and join Ted Sorensen's speechwriting team under great pressure not to go to Notre Dame, but I had postponed it. And so I joined it, and I got there, and Ted started on his staff in April 1960. And Ted Sorensen greeted me by saying, "See, I told you that you should have come last year instead of now, because last year if you had come, you'd be at the very center of everything, but we've got now this new guy that's probably a better speechwriter than you, Bob Goodwin." Dick Goodwin. Doris Kearns is a very significant husband in the King days. They discovered that they had real trouble with the Negro vote, so-called, that they were falling behind in the polls, even Stevenson's degree against Eisenhower, and that it was serious. And the Kennedy, after having, I guess, the first warning that something like this might happen, he picked me up on the streets, Senator Kennedy, in Georgetown. I was heading up to the office in the Senate, and he said, "Hop in." And he said, "You've got 10 minutes to tell me the 6 things I ought to do on civil rights to clean up this mess if I'm president." And I had my chance, and among other things, I said executive action, including signing with one stroke of a pen, signing the order for ending discrimination in federally assisted housing, hearings that Father Hesburger, for whose counsel I was in the Civil Rights Commission, had held, et cetera. And so I pulled that out among the other things I ticked off. And he loved this one stroke of a pen. I can do it with one stroke of a pen. And he said that. And sure enough, I got warning that he was likely to talk about civil rights and went out to the debate with Nixon. And sure enough, after Nixon didn't do as well as he should on that answer, Kennedy had a lot of statistics that we had fed him, of the disparity, the inequalities. And then he said, "And I will, with one stroke of a pen, sign that executive order that's been on Eisenhower's desk for 12 months or something like that." And so now I get called in by Kennedy and said, "We want you to go down and be assistant to Sergeant Shriver, starting a new section called Civil Rights Section." And I dutifully went down with delight, because by then I had already discovered that Sergeant Shriver was the most fun and the most inspiring person I'd ever worked with until then. And with all due respect to other people that are in the room for whom I have the same kinds of feelings in varying degrees, Sergeant Shriver was extraordinary. So a major factor for the rest of his life, as long as he was with us in the realm of politics. So the call to Mrs. King came out of that background. King got arrested, and then we helped get him released from the Atlanta jail. Mayor Hartsfield helped, and the county judge seized him and put him in a county jail, and later to the state penitentiary for violating parole. He had been driving a novelist, Lillian Smith, to the airport or something, and was charged with driving with an out-of-state driver's license and sentenced to 6 months, I believe the first charge was. He revived this county judge, and sentenced him to 4 months of hard labor because he had been on this sit-in at Rich's department store that he hadn't really hoped would happen during the election, but the SNCC young people went ahead and did it, and he felt he had to be part of it with them. And he was the one that stayed in jail, and Coretta had called me the morning after he had been taken in the middle of the night to the state penitentiary in chains, not knowing where he was going. She was 6 months pregnant. And Louis Martin, my Shriver's and my great colleague in the civil rights section, African-American publisher, et cetera, and I were having beer together, worried that we hadn't done anything at this moment that showed, Kennedy hadn't done anything that showed his concern, sympathy, potential action. And I said, well, if these beautiful, passionate Kennedys would just show their passion sometimes, if Jack would just call Mrs. King, he had promised, we learned later, he had promised the governor he wouldn't issue a public statement if the governor of Georgia agreed to find the way to get him out. And Louis said that's what we want. It's the right thing to do, and it would be good politics. And we got Sergeant Shriver on the phone, and he said, it's the right thing to do. He said, hope that I don't get arrested. He's leaving O'Hare soon, and I'm going to go out to the hotel, but hope I haven't speeded enough to get arrested. When he got there, the Sorensen, Salinger, O'Brien, the team was there, and he said, if I bring it up now, it'll never happen. It'll be a committee. It won't happen. He waited, and finally Kenny O'Donnell went into the John, and nobody was in the room. This is Sarge's account of what happened. And he said, you know, what you've been wanting to do is something that, you want to do something, but you're hamstrung in issuing a public announcement. Why don't you call Mrs. King on the phone? Shriver took the blame initially for this, for making this call. Kennedy thought for a couple of minutes, or less than that probably. One of his typical smiles came over his face on occasion, and said, that sounds like a good idea. Do you have her number? Sarge had the number, dialed it. Kennedy spoke to her, and the next thing we knew before, I guess the first thing was she called me the next morning and said, I think you put him up to it, and now somebody's calling. And somebody had leaked that something was happening, and am I free to tell what happened in this call? She told me that he was very warm and supportive. And I said, did he say that it was private? And she said, no, he didn't say anything. We just had a nice conversation. I said, you're free to do what you want. And Daddy King, now remember, I'm basically working for Robert Kennedy, who was head of the campaign. So I was somewhat of a subversive person. And Pierre Salinger goes in the airplane on the way to Detroit and said, did you do anything I ought to know about while we were out of the room? And he said, yeah, I talked to Mrs. Martin Luther King. And Pierre said, you did what? So the next thing we know, Robert Kennedy called and got John Siegenthaler and Louis Martin and me on the phone, saying, not on the phone, that's later, that's when Bob called the judge. He got us into the room with him, and in his cool anger, which I gather on the phone he had conveyed to Sarge earlier or shortly thereafter, he said, you bomb throwers have probably lost the election. There were at least 3 Southern governors had warned that if we supported Khrushchev, Castro, or Martin Luther King, they'd throw their states to Nixon. I'm not saying that happened, but that's what Robert Kennedy said. And nothing more from the civil rights section, nothing more. You're closed down. 24 hours later, sort of the beginning of the curve transforming Robert Kennedy on this whole issue, he called and John Siegenthaler and got me on the phone with him and said, can you just write a statement explaining why I called that judge in Georgia? And we said, you called him? And on the phone we said, and he said, yeah, I'm going. And his account to me was, to John and me was, I got so angry thinking of that cracker judge with a little more colorful language, putting a decent American in jail, that I called that judge and said, you'll get Martin Luther King. If you're a good American, you'll get King out of jail by sunset. But can't you get a statement out saying that I had an aide inquire about his right to bail? And we got the statement out. The follow-up was the bold Sergeant Shriver said to Louis Martin, who came up with the idea of what got called the blue bomb, that it wouldn't be issuing a public statement if we got out a compilation of what King said when he came out of jail, which was very thankful to Senator Kennedy, what Daddy King said, which was, if he had the courage to wipe the tears from my daughter-in-law's eyes, I have the courage to vote for a Catholic for president. He had been on an ad in the Atlanta Constitution of Baptist preachers saying, don't elect the Pope, don't vote for a Catholic, whatever the ad said. And he said, I have a suitcase full of votes, and I'm going to take them up to Washington and put them in the lap of Senator Kennedy. And Louis said, we can get these quotes. The head of the Black Baptists and one other person, Bill Gray's minister in Philadelphia, became the ostensible publisher of this pamphlet instead of the campaign. And I can't go to jail for that now. And it said this, a candidate with the, no comment Nixon versus a candidate with the heart. And Sarge was the first one getting the pamphlet. We sent him out to our civil rights people all over the country, just the initial ones. He, as I understand it, had before long 250,000 printed for the greater Chicago area. And Louis Martin, who came from there, helped organize so that allegedly practically every black church distributed them on Sunday morning before the election. Some say it was 2 million copies of it in the end. The Greyhound bus that left for North Carolina at something like 5 in the morning in time to get for the churches in North Carolina. Louis Martin and I and other characters like us took the bales of the Blue Bomb pamphlet onto the Greyhound bus. And Teddy White, I think, says 2 million copies, but it was a huge, it's pre-social. Now, just to, so you know, one other thing. When I was cleared for the White House, the Burke Marshall in charge of civil rights and voting rights for the Attorney General called me one day and he said, Harris, I've got a serious problem. Our investigators have found that you have committed 180 crimes. And they've traced the blue bombs everywhere to where did you get them from? And whatever the number was said we got them from Harris Wofford or maybe Louis Martin. And he said it is clearly a violation of the criminal law to distribute, especially on a scale like this, to distribute literature without saying who published it and who paid for it. And I sweated internally for a few minutes when Burke said, but the Attorney General has just weighed the matter and said it's de minimis.
So John F. Kennedy wins the election, he becomes president, and later there would be a meeting at the White House in the private residence between Martin Luther King and President Kennedy. But that meeting kind of got off to an odd start.
Oh, you like the elevator story. We had supper together. That's how he's so well primed.
Right. Well, it is the next story. It's part of the next story.
Yeah. Well, the meeting in the spring of 1960 was a crucial one because, rightly, I think, but to the great dismay of the organized civil rights movement, the decision was made that despite very ardent campaign speeches, despite the platform being specific, despite a special letter that Senator Kennedy got out when the Republicans, in a trick, introduced the Democratic far-reaching civil rights plank that the Kennedy campaign supported at the convention. They introduced it as legislation, knowing it couldn't possibly be passed. that it would a third of the Democrats, or a fourth of them at least in the Senate, were committed to segregation, and it would create not only a filibuster, but it might not even get that far. It would be a catastrophe. And so got a special statement pledging that in the first session of Congress, the Democrats are going to vote against the Democratic platform because they didn't want that fiasco to come before the election. Now, some of us should have been foresighted enough to know that executive action isn't as simple as one stroke of a pen. I learned because he delayed the one stroke of a pen because Southern legislators had said, we can't get elected if you issue this order ending segregation. And the civil rights movement, remembering the one stroke of a pen, sent pens in. And so as the pens accumulated, saying one stroke of a pen, thousands of them were sent. Allegedly, when the first batch was dumped on Kennedy's desk, he said, send them over to Wofford. He's the one that gave me that line. So now the much more serious question, because the delaying, he did sign it in due course, was small compared to the decision that they could not bring up civil rights in the first Congress, because it would be using your capital to no good. It would have been a fiasco. It would have been a defeat. And I agreed with that decision. The civil rights movement's leaders, by and large, of course, didn't agree with the decision. The key person in making it a hot, dangerous political matter was the NAACP and Roy Wilkins of the NAACP. But he was the one burning with frustration and anger at this happening. But the one person who could calm the situation was Martin Luther King. And he was invited, and I think maybe Louis and I, but in any case, I know I took him up to the private quarters, and we got on the elevator to go up. It's the only time I've been in the private quarters, except when I was seeing Eleanor Roosevelt in 1944.
But that's another story.
Another story.
Understand?
I'm not going into it. So now you wanted me to tell the elevator story.
Right.
So we got into the elevator, and instead of going up, it went down and picked up Jacqueline Kennedy in jeans, ashes over her clothes and her here and there in her face. And she said in her inimitable voice, I can imitate Eleanor Roosevelt, but I won't, but I can't really imitate Jacqueline. But in her inimitable voice, she said, oh, Dr. King, I just wish you had been spending the morning with me going through the antiques down where Andrew Jackson furniture we discovered. It would have thrilled you, et cetera. And I thought, oh my God, this is sort of off message right now. But when we got to the spot, she said, I know you're going into Jack for important matters. And she departed. And King turned me completely mellowed and said, wasn't that wonderful? I love that. Now, the reason, the meeting, they were both at their best. I would say 30, 40 minutes, probably 40 minutes at least. King first made the pitch for a new Emancipation Proclamation that would cover the whole range of executive action. A great idea that had a case for it and a case against it. And certainly it wasn't the place where John Kennedy was at that moment. Kennedy then made the case of why they couldn't have legislation. And each made very powerful cases, and they had a good conversation. And I was feeling, very proud of both of them, actually. And as we left, I didn't know what King's reaction really was. And it turns out it was very benign in the press. What he said to Louis and me as we went out, he said, well, I had hoped that President Kennedy would have what we've been yearning for from a president, one who has political intelligence, the intelligence to understand the problem, the political skill to solve it, and the moral passion to see it through, almost in those good words. And then he said, I'm certainly convinced he's got the intelligence and political skills. We'll just have to see how the moral passion works out.
So you were President Kennedy's point man on civil rights, but Sergeant Shriver had a big idea that dovetailed nicely with your own ideals and your interests, and off you went to Ethiopia.
It's a second trip that my wife didn't approve of. But she came to approving. It was probably the greatest adventure in our lives, and all three of my children here, my two sons and my daughter, two of them remember Ethiopia very vividly. The siren call not only of action and of the world, the large integration of the white minority into the majority of the world that's of color and poor, the turning to that sort of larger view of the world, and the seductive power of the most strikingly appealing person, empowering person that I ever worked with. Well, I was on leave from the White House to help organize Malawi, Togo, and for the Peace Corps, and Ethiopia. Look at Emperor Haile Selassie's letter for wanting 500 Peace Corps teachers to help double the number of secondary school teachers in Ethiopia to be ready for the new university that was growing. And so I was on that trip, and Sarge sent me a cable saying, you know, when you get home, I'm going to try to persuade you to go and be the head of the biggest program we had there in Ethiopia, and be this special representative to Africa south of the Sahara. And don't worry about Claire, I will brainwash her. And I called Claire. I finally got through to her because I was so scared that would be happening. Because she hadn't wanted to go really to India, I had learned, and in due course, and hadn't really wanted to go to Notre Dame she had good jobs in both cases that she had to leave. And self-centeredly or whatever, she said, I called her and said, don't worry about whatever Sarge is saying. He hadn't called her by then, but when she met me at the airport, she said she could see we were headed for Ethiopia. And in the end, I think she thought it was one of the best family occasions we ever had. The Peace Corps in Ethiopia did double the number of college graduate school teachers. All of secondary education was in English in Ethiopia, and is. It's an extraordinary land that most of the more than 1,000 Peace Corps volunteers who served before Mengistu, the dictator, took over. The Peace Corps in Ethiopia and Africa was 90% school teachers in secondary, in some cases university, in some cases elementary schools. They were not unstructured programs. In many cases, the problem was the structure of English education and syllabus and literature and exams was too structured. And the Peace Corps volunteers, I had a new spirit. They discovered, for example, that the U.S. aid program had supported hundreds of thousands of textbooks, in the new textbooks, and they had been assured that they were at this school. And suddenly we had a crisis that I had to go up to Desi because the volunteers had discovered that the caretaker of the books had the books for 2 years, locked in a warehouse in the school storage room, and that they had gone through all the persuasion they could find, and he had his mandate to see that no book was lost, damaged, or destroyed. And he was a little emperor, and he said, I've had a perfect record till now. Not one of these books has been lost, damaged, or destroyed. The volunteers broke open the door of the warehouse and distributed it to their children. Now, that was not sort of what the Peace Corps recommended students to do.
Right.
So it had many ups and downs, but it was, it's one of the lives I've been lucky to lead.
So before we leave the Peace
One
Corps,
lingers on.
real quickly, tell the story, and quickly, the story about the push that Eunice Shriver gave to Sergeant Shriver to ensure the independence of the Peace Corps.
That's the first one that you haven't quite stated accurately. When we were on the trip around the world, seeing of heads of states, and I was lucky to go with Sergeant Shriver on that. We were in India and learned, by the way, every one of those places we visited said yes, they wanted the Peace Corps. We got the word that the recommendation of an administrative committee that the staff had set up, that the Peace Corps should be 3 layers down in a new aid program under people resources, and then various parts of it, then a little notch there for Sergeant Shriver and the Peace Corps, way down in the bureaucracy. And Sarge had written such a powerful case against that conclusion that we were confident when we left that the president, getting this personal case, would see the point, that the Peace Corps should have essential autonomy. We got the word that no, he had upheld this, and it was too bad, but he had given it full thought, and he had upheld that decision. Sarge called Bill Moyers, who by then wanted to go to the Peace Corps, and we had gotten him installed there, Sarge had. And we called Bill and said, the one hope we have, we think, is getting Lyndon Johnson to make a case as vice president and as chair of the Peace Corps Advisory Council that we had just established. Moyers went in, talked to Johnson. He immediately, we're told, got to see the president, saying, you can't do this. This great, potentially wonderful new wine, if you pour it in the, he said, stinking old bottle of the aid program. Not my view of the aid program, but Johnson said, the most unpopular program on Capitol Hill right now. You'll never know what the Peace Corps could be. And after Johnson, in very colorful language that Moyers wrote down, and it's in some of the writings, at his most powerful, the president said, very well, if you and Sarge feel so strongly, you can have your independence. There was a minor problem that we had started the Peace Corps by executive order, the executive action, and there did have to be an authorization, but there was some discretionary money that the president assigned to this new idea, and we had several hundred volunteers in 6 countries before Congress finally passed the bill authorizing it. I wish we could do fun things like that easily now. But anyway, he was beginning to despair because the White House legislative body didn't lift a finger to help get the bill through. It was Kennedy's baby, and it was, in that sense, his bill. But the Larry O'Brien and the team they were very angry that we had gone over their heads. And Sarge had said he'd never done this before. He asked Eunice, who was a great creator herself of Special Olympics and extraordinary things, one of the great women, and we were all scared of her because we were all competing for Sarge's time. But and Eunice is the one that pushed the president for starting a domestic Peace Corps after Sarge said, I can't handle both. But in this case, she agreed to go and talk to her brother to ask for help in getting the bill through. And she came back and said, Sarge, I've got bad news. Jack said that you insisted over his best judgment of having independence so you can get your own bill through yourself. Now, to be fair to the president, a year later, when I was heading forth to Ethiopia, and it was the last time I escorted him out to the lawn to say goodbye to Peace Corps volunteers. It was always a wonderful occasion because the volunteers say things like, in the first wave, "Why did you join the Peace Corps?" And his answer was, the volunteer, "Nobody had ever asked me to do something patriotic, unselfish before Kennedy asked." Well, in this case, there were 600 volunteers on the lawn, 300 of whom were going with me to Ethiopia. And on the way back in to the Oval Office, last time I saw the president, we were in Ethiopia when he was killed. Kennedy turned to me and said, "You know, this idea, I thought it, one of the jokes is he repeatedly said, I thought I was giving Sarge a lemon, but he made it lemonade." What he said to me was, this idea will be really serious when it's 100,000 Peace Corps volunteers a year. And then in each decade, there'll be 1 million Americans with firsthand experience in Asia, Africa, or Latin America. And then we will have a large constituency for a good foreign policy. The Peace Corps has made a huge contribution with only 200,000 instead of 2 million by now. Just think what it might have been with 500 who spoke Arabic in terms of our policy in that world. Just think of what 2 million, if you knew how much those 200,000 have meant in this country, 200 million makes one very sad.
You would leave politics for a little while. You'd become a college president, university president. Those titles and accomplishments would be added to your CV. But it would be a tragic plane crash that would put you back on the national stage, first with a gubernatorial appointment to the Senate to fill the seat of John Hines, Senator Hines. But then you would lose that seat to a man we all know as Rick Santorum.
My great colleagues of the Sheridan Group gave me a poster of the Wofford campaign that supposedly is somewhere around. We brought it up because they've added on it Wofford, the man who made Rick Santorum famous. Now, that's a better way of putting it than I've been saying jokingly, that I bequeathed Santorum to the country. Well, I had like the story of national service and the Peace Corps, there's a roller coaster that we have, and I certainly had an exciting one when a very popular former governor and Attorney General of the United States under George H.W. Bush was persuaded to go back to reclaim the John Hines' seat that Hines had occupied. I was 44, 7, whatever the polls were then, behind him, and I did have the brilliance to hire James Carville and Paul Begala, who actually, I think, inscribed that poster as coaches and managers of the campaign. They made a lot of difference, but also it was beginning the roller coaster ride in which things changed so fast. Carville's #1 principle in the campaign was never criticize George H.W. Bush. He's 70% popular after the Gulf War. Don't touch him. You can criticize the savings and loans or other policies, but don't touch them. And I broke the discipline about 10 days before the election. There was a sense of victory, that things had changed in a way that was hard to believe. I always thought we might win, but that was because I'm intellectually have a tragic view of the world, but my DNA is optimism, the comic lens on life. But so I. At Uniontown, Pennsylvania, I was a steel worker. Joe Smith, as I came in, said, "Senator, your victory next Tuesday is going to mark the first day of the end of the Bush administration." And carried away, I got on the stage and opened with just that. It's going to mark the first day of the end of the Bush administration. A few minutes later, I got in the car. Before long, I think Dan, the chair of my campaign, right there, may have been the first to call and lash me for violating this. Carville was in there saying, "Senator, you have lost the election," etc. "You can't do it. Never touch that again." I got the and my wife called. So at least those three. And so when we won by 10 points in a landslide, I began my statement last week. Joe Smith said, and our victory tonight marks the first day of the end of the Bush administration, which I think set a certain kind of barrier up to my relations with George H.W. Bush. Except, I have to say this, that the Senate party given by the president each year for the Senate at Christmas holiday time, Passover, Christmas, very elaborate black tie, dining room, Marine band. Bill Cohen, as we went in, the senator from Maine and his soon-to-be wife, said, "Do you mind if we step behind you instead of arguing before you?" as we had our photo taken and shook hands. And I said, "No, why?" And he said, "We think, it must be that the Bushes will think of you as the ghost of Christmas future. We want to see the look on their face." Well, Barbara was a little frosty, and it was 5 more years, or maybe a little longer than that, with America's Promise and other things, out at Kennebunkport when George H.W. agreed to do something big and major for America's Promise. Wonderful time. And as I left, Barbara said, I should tell you that I have decided that I like you." So that was my happy moment on that. George Bush, from the very first time I met him on that occasion, and all the time thereafter, not only was very warm and gracious, he said, "Declare, I've followed your campaign. I know how much you campaigned too. I know how tired you are because I've been in your shoes, winning and losing. And I urge you to go and take care of the tiredness in your bones. Go to the Caribbean or to the mountains." And we did, and the rest. But on national service, from the first encounter with him, through, and I don't know if Greg Petersmeyer is here, but the first special assistant for national service has been in a strategy session this afternoon. Is Greg here?
He's waving. He's
Hey,
waving back there.
You don't know what suffering I'm going through. I can't see anybody's face except in the front row. But the merger of the two ideas of points of light and AmeriCorps and National Full-Time Service as twin engines that needed to go together. Something that, Bush signed the first National Service Act, a Ted Kennedy initiative, but that gave a great push to the Points of Light movement. And he was with us, and I have to say, since I'm not dealing with an election, that George W. Bush, after a certain difficult period, after 9/11, took the Corporation for National Service from 50,000, where I left as CEO, to 75,000 members. And the roller coaster ride of the national service idea is another story.
And another story that we won't have time for, but the last story, the story when you met that young, promising freshman from Illinois, and as a former senator, obviously you have the ability to go back to the Senate floor, and there's one time you said something rather poignant to him. What was it?
I have to say that en route in 2 sentences, that by 1968, I think the country was in a worse state of division than we're in now. And I, having had rough times with Robert Kennedy, by the end of those years before he was killed, he had become more passionately concerned about fulfilling the civil rights of all Americans and about peace in Vietnam and about ending poverty than anyone, up to then anyway, in my life. And so it meant a lot to me. I don't know what it meant to Barack Obama. He was sitting either in the seat I had in the Senate, or Dianne Feinstein says it was where I sat, up on that particular part of the Senate. And formers can not only, the high perk is to be able to park in the parking lot there, and the other one is to be able to go on the floor if you don't lobby, et cetera. And so on one of the state occasions for a State of the Union or a message or something, I made the point of having several times when I met him on the floor conveyed how much the 2004 convention speech had made to me, and I'd followed his speeches since then. And so well before he decided to run, I went up to him and said, I've been waiting a long time to be able to support a president. I've been waiting for a long time for a candidate for president who would mean as much to me or meant to the country as Robert Kennedy did. And I said, I think I found him, and don't wait too long.
Harris Wofford.
Thank you.